In a quiet corner of a bustling Seattle cafe, a young woman sat alone with her Earl Grey, unaware that her ordinary afternoon was about to shatter. A man in an expensive suit slid into the chair across from her, his dark eyes urgent and commanding. "Pretend you're my wife," he whispered, just as 3 armed men burst through the door. Her breath caught. This stranger wasn't asking. He was giving her seconds to decide if she'd survive the next 5 minutes. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. The rain had been falling on Seattle for 3 days straight, turning the streets into rivers of gray that reflected the city's steel and glass skyline. Inside the Emerald Cup Cafe on Pine Street, the air smelled of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon, a warm refuge from the October chill that seeped through every crack in the old brick building. Nora sat by the window, watching droplets race down the glass, her hands wrapped around a porcelain cup that had gone lukewarm. She came here every Thursday afternoon, a ritual she'd built after moving to the city 6 months ago, a small act of normalcy in a life that had felt anything but normal since her mother's death. She was 24, with auburn hair that fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and green eyes that held a quiet sadness. She tried to hide behind polite smiles. Today she wore a cream sweater and jeans, her leather bag resting on the chair beside her, filled with resumes she'd printed that morning. The job search had been brutal. Seattle was expensive, and her savings were running dry. She'd left Spokane with nothing but a suitcase and a desperate need to escape the memories that haunted every corner of her childhood home. The cafe was half empty, the usual afternoon crowd thinned by the relentless rain. An elderly couple sat near the counter, sharing a slice of apple pie. A college student typed furiously on a laptop in the corner, headphones blocking out the world. The barista, a young man with a nose ring and tired eyes, wiped down the espresso machine with mechanical precision. Nora took a sip of her tea and opened her notebook, trying to focus on the list of companies she planned to contact tomorrow. But her mind kept drifting to the overdue rent notice taped to her apartment door, the final warning from her landlord that she had until the end of the month. The bell above the door chimed, and a gust of cold air swept through the cafe. Nora glanced up, expecting another rain-soaked customer, but the man who entered made her breath catch in her throat. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his charcoal suit perfectly. His dark hair was slicked back, still damp from the rain, and his face was all sharp angles, strong jaw, high cheekbones, a nose that looked like it had been broken once and healed slightly crooked. But it was his eyes that held her attention, deep brown, almost black, and filled with an intensity that made her feel like he could see straight through her. He scanned the cafe with the precision of a man assessing threats, his gaze lingering on the exits, the windows, the other patrons. Then his eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the 2 of them. He moved toward her table with purpose, his expensive leather shoes barely making a sound on the worn wooden floor. Nora's pulse quickened. She didn't know this man, had never seen him before, but something in the way he carried himself, the coiled tension in his movements, the way his hand hovered near his jacket as if reaching for something, set off every alarm bell in her head. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without asking, leaning forward so their faces were only inches apart. "Pretend you're my wife," he said, his voice low and urgent, barely above a whisper. His breath smelled faintly of mint. "Don't ask questions. Don't look at the door. Just smile and touch my hand like you love me." Nora's mouth went dry. "What now?" he interrupted, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no cruelty in his tone, but there was command, the kind of voice that expected obedience without question. 3 men just walked in. They're here to kill me. If they think you're with me, they'll hesitate. That hesitation might save both our lives." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to call for help, to do anything but sit here with this stranger who'd just dragged her into something dangerous. But when she glanced past his shoulder, she saw them. 3 men in dark jackets, their faces hard and expressionless, fanning out across the cafe. One moved toward the counter, blocking the barista's view. Another positioned himself near the door. The third walked slowly toward their table, his hand inside his jacket. The stranger, this man who'd commandeered her afternoon and possibly her life, reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm, his grip firm, but not painful. "Smile," he murmured, and there was something almost gentle in his voice now, a plea hidden beneath the command. Please. Nora didn't know why she did it. Maybe it was the fear that froze her limbs and made thinking impossible. Maybe it was the way his thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gesture so tender it seemed impossible from a man who radiated danger. Or maybe it was the look in his eyes, not just urgency, but something deeper, a flicker of vulnerability that told her he was just as scared as she was, even if he hid it better. She smiled. It felt unnatural, her lips trembling, but she forced herself to hold his gaze and squeeze his hand back. "Darling," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "You're soaking wet. Did you forget your umbrella again?" Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. He smiled back, and for a moment, he looked almost human, almost like a man who could sit in a cafe on a rainy afternoon and talk about forgotten umbrellas. "You know me," he said, his voice louder now, pitched for the men who were closing in, always rushing out without thinking. The man approaching their table slowed, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. A couple holding hands, sharing an intimate moment, oblivious to the danger. He stopped a few feet away, his hand still inside his jacket, and exchanged a glance with one of his companions. The stranger, Nora's supposed husband, kept his eyes on her, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, the coiled readiness of a predator waiting to strike. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice flat and emotionless. He had a scar running down his left cheek, and his eyes were cold, empty. "We're looking for someone. Tall guy, dark suit. You seen anyone like that come in here?" The stranger turned slowly, his hand still holding Nora's, his expression politely confused. "Just us and the folks over there," he said, nodding toward the elderly couple. "Why? Is there a problem?" The scarred man studied him for a long moment, his gaze flicking to Nora, then back. She forced herself to keep breathing, to maintain the smile, to play the role of a woman enjoying tea with her husband. Her free hand trembled in her lap, hidden beneath the table. The seconds stretched into an eternity, the only sounds the hiss of the espresso machine and the drumming of rain against the windows. Finally, the scarred man stepped back. "No problem," he said, though his eyes said otherwise. He gestured to his companions, and the three of them moved toward the door, their movements synchronized and efficient. The bell chimed as they left, and through the window, Nora watched them climb into a black SUV that peeled away from the curb, its tires spraying water across the sidewalk. The stranger released her hand and sat back, exhaling slowly. For the first time since he'd sat down, he looked tired, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You just saved my life." Nora stared at him, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. "Who are you?" she whispered. Who were those men? He reached into his jacket, the same gesture that had terrified her moments ago, and pulled out a wallet. From it, he extracted a stack of $100 bills and placed them on the table between them. "My name is Xander," he said, "and I'm sorry for dragging you into this. Take the money. Leave Seattle if you can. Forget you ever saw me." He stood, adjusting his suit jacket, and turned toward the door. But Nora's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist before she could think better of it. He froze, looking down at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Wait," she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by adrenaline and a reckless desperation she didn't fully understand. "You said pretending to be your wife saved your life. What if I kept pretending? What if we made a deal?" Xander's eyes narrowed. "What kind of deal?" Nora glanced at the money on the table, then back at him. "I need help. I'm broke. I'm about to be evicted, and I have no one. You clearly need someone who can make you look normal, domestic, whatever it is you're trying to hide from. So let's help each other." For a moment, he just stared at her, and she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Then slowly, he sat back down, his expression unreadable. "You have no idea what you're asking for," he said softly. "The world I live in, it's not safe, it's not kind. And once you're in, getting out is almost impossible." "I'm already in," Nora said, surprised by her own boldness. "The moment you sat down, you made me part of this. So either you walk away and leave me wondering when those men will come back, or you give me a reason to take the risk." Xander studied her for a long moment, and she could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of options and consequences. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, erasing footprints and tire tracks, leaving no evidence that anything had happened here at all. Finally, he extended his hand across the table. 1 month, he said. You pretend to be my wife for 1 month. I'll pay you $50,000 and make sure you're protected. After that, we go our separate ways, and you never speak of this again. Nora looked at his hand, at the calluses on his palm, and the faint scar across his knuckles, evidence of a life lived in violence. She thought of her empty apartment, her dwindling bank account, the crushing weight of loneliness that had followed her from Spokane. She thought of her mother's voice, always telling her to be careful, to play it safe, to never take risks. And then she reached out and shook his hand, sealing a bargain that would change everything. Xander's car was a black Mercedes with leather seats that smelled like expensive cologne and danger. Nora sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the city blur past through rain-streaked windows. They drove north through downtown Seattle, past the Space Needle rising like a silver sentinel against the gray sky, past the bustling Pike Place market where vendors were packing up their stalls for the evening. Xander drove with the same controlled intensity he did everything else, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors, his jaw tight. "Where are we going?" Nora asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since they'd left the cafe. "Somewhere safe," he replied, taking a turn onto a tree-lined street in the Queen Anne neighborhood. The houses here were massive, old Victorian mansions that spoke of old money and older secrets. He pulled into the driveway of a 3-story home painted deep blue with white trim, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. A wrought iron fence surrounded the property, and Nora noticed the security cameras mounted at every corner. Inside, the house was even more impressive. Hardwood floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Original artwork hung on walls painted in rich, muted tones. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister carved from dark mahogany. But despite the elegance, there was something cold about the space, something that suggested it was more showpiece than home. No family photos on the mantel, no clutter on the tables, no signs that anyone actually lived here. "This is where you live?" Nora asked, setting her bag down in the marble-floored entryway. "One of the places," Xander said, shrugging off his jacket and draping it over a chair. Beneath it, he wore a shoulder holster with a gun nestled against his ribs. Nora's eyes widened, and he followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The men who came to that cafe today weren't random. They work for Viktor Kozlov, a rival who's been trying to take over my territory for the past 6 months. This isn't a game, Nora. This is my life. And now, for the next month, it's yours too. Territory. Rival." The words settled over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating and undeniable. "You're in the Mafia," she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Xander's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I prefer to think of myself as a businessman with unconventional methods. But yes, if you want to use that word, I run one of the largest operations in the Pacific Northwest. Shipping, real estate, investments, all legitimate on the surface. But underneath," he trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Nora sank onto a velvet sofa, her legs suddenly unsteady. What had she done? She'd agreed to pretend to be the wife of a mafia boss, to enter a world where men with guns hunted people in cafes, where violence lurked beneath every polished surface. "I should leave," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You should," Xander agreed, moving to a bar cart and pouring himself 2 fingers of whiskey. "But you won't, because you need the money and because, whether you want to admit it or not, part of you is curious. Part of you wants to see what happens next." He was right, and she hated that he could read her so easily. She did need the money, desperately. But more than that, she was tired of being invisible, of drifting through life like a ghost. For the first time in months, she felt something other than numbness. Fear, yes, but also a strange, electric excitement. "So what happens now?" she asked, looking up at him. Xander drained his glass and set it down with a soft click. "Now we make you convincing. Tomorrow I have a meeting with some associates. They know I've been seeing someone, but they haven't met you yet. You'll need to play the part perfectly. Loving, attentive, comfortable in my world. Can you do that?" Nora thought of all the roles she'd played in her life. The dutiful daughter, the grieving orphan, the struggling transplant trying to make it in a new city. What was one more? "I can try," she said. "Trying isn't good enough," Xander said, his voice hardening. "These people are predators. They'll sense weakness, hesitation, fear. If they suspect for even a moment that you're not who you claim to be, they'll use it against me, against us." He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, bringing them eye to eye. This close, she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises, the faint stubble along his jaw, the thin scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "I need you to understand the stakes," he said softly. "Victor's men today, that was just a warning. He's testing me, looking for vulnerabilities. If he finds out I've brought someone into my life, someone I care about, he'll target you to get to me. The only way this works is if you commit completely. No hesitation, no second guessing. You're my wife, and you love me. Can you do that?" Nora's heart pounded in her chest. She thought of the way he'd held her hand in the cafe, the tenderness in that simple gesture. She thought of the $50,000 that could change her life, give her a fresh start, a chance to breathe, and she thought of the alternative, returning to her empty apartment, to the crushing weight of loneliness and failure. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I can do that." Something flickered in Xander's eyes. Approval, maybe, or relief. He stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, I'll show you to your room. We have a lot of work to do before tomorrow." The bedroom he led her to was on the second floor, decorated in shades of cream and gold. A king-sized bed dominated the space, covered in silk sheets that looked like they cost more than her monthly rent. French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking the backyard, where a garden lay dormant under the October rain. Nora's bag looked pathetically small, sitting on the plush carpet. "There are clothes in the closet," Xander said, gesturing to a walk-in that was larger than her entire apartment. "My assistant picked them out based on your size. If anything doesn't fit, let me know, and we'll get it adjusted." Nora opened the closet and gasped. Dresses, skirts, blouses, all designer labels she'd only seen in magazines. Shoes lined the bottom shelf, elegant heels and soft leather boots. Jewelry sparkled in velvet-lined boxes on a center island. "This is too much," she said, running her fingers over a silk dress the color of midnight. "It's necessary," Xander corrected. "My wife wouldn't wear off-the-rack clothes from Target. She'd dress like she belongs in my world. Tomorrow, you'll wear the green dress. It'll bring out your eyes. And this." He picked up a jewelry box and opened it, revealing a stunning diamond ring and matching wedding band. "These were my grandmother's. They're real, and they're worth more than most people make in a year. Don't lose them." He slipped the rings onto her finger, and Nora stared at them, the weight foreign and surreal. The diamond caught the light, throwing rainbows across the walls. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "They're a prop," Xander said, but his voice had softened, "just like everything else in this house. Remember that." He left her alone then, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Nora sat on the edge of the bed, turning the rings on her finger, watching the diamond sparkle. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and through the French doors, she could see the Seattle skyline emerging from the clouds, the city lights beginning to glow in the gathering darkness. She thought of her mother, of what she would say if she could see her now. Probably something about being careful, about not trusting strangers, about the dangers of taking shortcuts. But her mother was gone, and Nora was alone. And sometimes being alone meant making choices that terrified you, just to feel something other than empty. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to her landlord. "I'll have the rent by the end of the week." Then she deleted it, knowing that in Xander's world, old connections were liabilities. She was someone new now, someone who wore diamond rings and designer dresses and pretended to love a man who carried a gun beneath his expensive suits. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as she lay back on the silk sheets and stared at the ceiling, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Alive. Morning came too quickly, gray light filtering through the French doors and pulling Nora from restless dreams. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with scenarios of everything that could go wrong. But when she opened her eyes and saw the diamond ring on her finger, reality crashed back with crystalline clarity. This wasn't a dream. She'd made a deal with a dangerous man, and today she'd have to prove she could keep her end of the bargain. A knock on the door made her sit up. "Come in," she called, pulling the silk robe she'd found in the closet tighter around herself. Xander entered carrying a tray with coffee and croissants. He'd already dressed for the day in a navy suit that fit him like it had been tailored to his exact measurements, which she realized it probably had been. His hair was still damp from a shower, and he smelled like cedar and something darker, more masculine. "Good morning, wife," he said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "We leave in 2 hours. I thought you might want breakfast." The casual intimacy of the gesture, bringing her breakfast in bed, felt strange and oddly touching. "Thank you," Nora said, reaching for the coffee. It was perfect, strong, with just a hint of cream. "How did you know how I take my coffee?" "I'm observant," Xander said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's how I've stayed alive this long. I notice things. How you held your teacup yesterday. The way you take small sips instead of gulps. The fact that you added cream but no sugar. Details matter in my world, Nora. They're the difference between life and death." She sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of the cup. In the morning light, he looked less dangerous, more human. There were shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept well either, and a tension in his shoulders that spoke of burdens she couldn't imagine. "Tell me about the people we're meeting today," she said. "What should I know?" Xander leaned back against the headboard, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "There are 3 key players. First, Marcus Chen. He runs my shipping operations out of the port of Seattle. Smart, ruthless, loyal to a fault. He's been with me since the beginning, and he's probably the closest thing I have to a friend. Then there's Elena Volkov. Don't let the last name fool you. She's not related to Victor. She handles my real estate portfolio, all the legitimate properties that keep the money clean. She's ambitious, calculating, and she doesn't trust easily. And finally, Father Dominic." "A priest?" Nora asked, surprised. "Retired," Xander clarified. "He runs a community center in Belltown, helps kids stay off the streets. I fund it, and in return he provides spiritual guidance, let's call it. He's also the only person who knows about my past, about where I came from. He'll be the hardest to fool because he can read people like books." Nora set down her coffee, her stomach knotting with anxiety. "And what's my story? How did we meet? How long have we been together?" "We met 8 months ago at a charity gala," Xander said, his voice taking on the practiced smoothness of a well-rehearsed lie. "You were working as an event coordinator. I was immediately drawn to your intelligence and grace. We started dating quietly. I wanted to keep you out of the spotlight, protect you from my world. But 3 months ago, I proposed, and you said yes. We got married in a small ceremony in the San Juan Islands. Just us and a justice of the peace. No one was invited because I didn't want to put you at risk. It was a good story, plausible and romantic enough to be believable." "And what do I do now?" Nora asked. "Do I work?" "You volunteer at Father Dominic's community center," Xander said. "Teaching art to kids. It's something you're passionate about, something that makes you light up when you talk about it. It's also conveniently vague enough that no one can fact-check it easily." Nora nodded, committing the details to memory. "And how do I act around you? What's our dynamic?" Xander's expression softened, and he reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so natural, so tender, that Nora's breath caught. "You love me," he said quietly. "Despite knowing what I am, what I do, you see something in me worth saving. You're my anchor, the one good thing in a life filled with darkness. When you look at me, there's affection in your eyes, but also concern. You worry about me, about the dangers I face. And He paused, his hand lingering against her cheek. "I'm softer with you than I am with anyone else. You're my weakness, but also my strength. Does that make sense?" It made too much sense. Nora could feel the heat of his palm against her skin, could see the intensity in his eyes that made her wonder how much of this was acting, and how much was something else entirely. "Yes," she whispered. "I understand." "Good," Xander said, pulling his hand back and standing abruptly, as if he'd realized he'd crossed some invisible line. "Get dressed. Wear the green dress and the pearls. And Nora?" He paused at the door, looking back at her. "Whatever happens today, don't be afraid to touch me. Hold my hand, lean against me, straighten my tie. Small gestures of intimacy are what sell the illusion. Can you do that?" Nora thought of the way he'd held her hand in the cafe, the way his thumb had brushed her knuckles. "I can do that," she said. An hour later, she stood in front of the full-length mirror, barely recognizing herself. The green dress hugged her curves perfectly, elegant without being ostentatious. The pearls at her throat were lustrous and heavy, real instead of the costume jewelry she usually wore. Her hair fell in soft waves, and she'd applied makeup with a careful hand, enough to look polished, not so much that she looked like she was trying too hard. The diamond ring sparkled on her finger, a constant reminder of the role she was playing. Xander appeared in the doorway, and for a moment, he just stared at her. "You look perfect," he said finally, his voice rough. "Like you were born to this." They drove to a restaurant in Belltown, an upscale Italian place with white tablecloths and waiters in crisp black vests. Marcus Chen was already there, sitting at a corner table with a view of Elliott Bay. He was in his early 40s, with sharp features and intelligent eyes that assessed Nora the moment they approached. Elena Volkov sat beside him, a striking woman in her 30s with platinum blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Father Dominic occupied the third seat, an older man with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Everyone," Xander said, his hand settling possessively on the small of Nora's back. "This is Nora, my wife." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marcus stood immediately, extending his hand with a warm smile. "It's wonderful to finally meet you," he said, his grip firm but friendly. "Xander's been keeping you hidden like a precious secret." "Can you blame me?" Xander replied, pulling out Nora's chair with a gentlemanly gesture that seemed second nature. "I wanted to keep her all to myself as long as possible." Nora smiled, letting her hand rest on Xander's arm as she sat. "He's been very protective," she said, her voice warm with affection. "But I told him I wanted to meet the people who are important to him. I can't stay hidden forever." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Nora with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. "How romantic," she said, her accent faintly Russian. "And what do you do, Nora, besides being Xander's beautiful wife?" "I volunteer at Father Dominic's community center," Nora said, turning to the priest with a genuine smile. "Teaching art to kids. It's incredibly rewarding." Father Dominic's eyes lit up. "Art is a wonderful way to reach young souls," he said. "What medium do you prefer?" Nora thought quickly, drawing on memories of high school art classes. "Watercolors, mostly. There's something about the way the colors blend and flow that feels freeing, like anything is possible." It was a good answer, heartfelt and specific enough to be believable. Father Dominic nodded approvingly, but Nora could see him watching her, those kind eyes seeing more than she wanted to reveal. The lunch proceeded with careful conversation, a dance of words and subtext. Marcus talked about shipping delays and port strikes, his language coded but clear to those who understood. Elena discussed property acquisitions in Pioneer Square, her tone suggesting these weren't just legitimate investments. And through it all, Xander played his part perfectly. Attentive husband, powerful boss, man who'd found something worth protecting. Nora played her part too. She laughed at Marcus's jokes, asked Elena thoughtful questions about real estate, and listened with genuine interest as Father Dominic talked about the kids at the center. And she touched Xander, small, natural gestures that sold the illusion, her hand on his knee under the table, her fingers straightening his collar when he leaned back, the way she leaned into him when he put his arm around her shoulders, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. But halfway through the meal, the atmosphere shifted. A man approached their table, young and nervous, whispering something in Marcus's ear. Marcus's expression darkened, and he leaned over to Xander. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "Victor's people hit one of our warehouses last night. 3 men dead, $500,000 in merchandise gone." Xander's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "We'll discuss it after lunch," he said, his hand finding Nora's under the table and squeezing gently. A gesture of reassurance, or perhaps a reminder to stay in character. But Elena was watching them, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "This is why I worry about you bringing Nora into our world," she said, her tone deceptively casual. "It's dangerous, Xander. Victor is escalating. If he finds out about her—" "He won't," Xander interrupted, his voice hard as steel. "Because everyone at this table understands that Nora is off limits. She's not part of the business. She's my wife, and she's protected. Anyone who threatens her answers to me. Is that clear?" The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Marcus nodded immediately. Elena's smile turned brittle, but she inclined her head in acknowledgement. Only Father Dominic looked troubled, his eyes moving between Xander and Nora with something that might have been concern or pity. After lunch, as they walked back to the car, Xander's hand remained on Nora's back, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. "You did well," he said absently, his eyes scanning the street for threats. "They believed you." "Did they?" Nora asked, thinking of Elena's calculating gaze and Father Dominic's knowing eyes. Xander stopped, turning to face her. They stood on a sidewalk in Belltown, the Space Needle visible in the distance, tourists and locals flowing around them like water around stones. Elena suspects something, he admitted. She's too smart not to. But suspicion isn't proof. As long as we're consistent, as long as we don't give her a reason to dig deeper, we'll be fine. And if Victor finds out about me? Nora asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since Marcus's whispered message. Xander's expression darkened, and for a moment, she saw the man who'd sat across from her in the cafe. Dangerous, desperate, capable of violence. Then I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe, he said quietly. That's not part of the act, Nora. That's a promise. The sincerity in his voice shook her. This was supposed to be pretend, a business arrangement with clear boundaries. But standing there on a Seattle sidewalk, with his hand warm against her back and his eyes burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with their arrangement, Nora realized that the lines were already blurring. And she didn't know if that terrified her or thrilled her more. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of carefully orchestrated performances. Nora accompanied Xander to dinners with business associates, charity events where they smiled for cameras, quiet evenings at home where they practiced the rhythms of married life. She learned to anticipate his moods, to read the tension in his shoulders when a deal went wrong, to know when to offer comfort and when to give him space. And slowly, terrifyingly, the act began to feel less like acting and more like living. They fell into routines, morning coffee on the balcony, watching the sun rise over Puget Sound, evenings in the study, where Xander worked while Nora read, their silence comfortable and companionable. Nights when she'd hear him moving through the house at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, haunted by demons he never named. She started leaving her door open on those nights, a silent invitation he never accepted, but seemed to appreciate nonetheless. But the outside world kept intruding. Victor's attacks grew bolder. Another warehouse hit, 2 of Xander's men hospitalized, a shipment intercepted by authorities who'd clearly been tipped off. The pressure was mounting, and Xander was fraying at the edges. Nora could see it in the way he gripped his whiskey glass too tightly, in the shadows that deepened under his eyes, in the moments when his mask slipped, and she glimpsed the exhaustion beneath. It was Father Dominic who finally forced the confrontation. He showed up at the house on a gray November afternoon, his presence unexpected and unwelcome. Xander was in a meeting, so Nora answered the door, surprised to find the priest standing on the porch with rain dripping from his coat. "Nora," he said gently, "may I come in? I'd like to talk to you." She should have said no, should have called Xander, should have maintained the boundaries of their carefully constructed lie. But there was something in Father Dominic's eyes, compassion mixed with concern, that made her step aside and let him enter. They sat in the living room, tea growing cold between them, and Father Dominic studied her with the same penetrating gaze he'd used at lunch. "You're not really his wife, are you?" he said finally, his voice kind but firm. Nora's heart stopped. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I've known Xander since he was 17 years old," Father Dominic said. "I found him on the streets of Belltown, half-starved and running from a past he wouldn't talk about. I've watched him build his empire, watched him become the man he is today, brilliant, ruthless, and profoundly lonely. And I've never, in all those years, seen him look at someone the way he looks at you." "Then you believe we're married," Nora said, clinging to the lie. "I believe he wishes you were," Father Dominic replied. "But I also believe this started as something else, an arrangement, perhaps, or a desperate measure. The question is, what is it now?" Nora stood, moving to the window, unable to meet his eyes. Outside, the rain fell steadily, turning the garden into a watercolor of grays and greens. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Love usually is," Father Dominic said, and the word love hit her like a physical blow. "But complications become dangerous in Xander's world. Victor Kozlov is a monster, Nora. He's killed men for less than what Xander has. And if he discovers that you're important to Xander, if he sees you as a weakness to exploit, he won't hesitate to use you." "Xander said he'd protect me," Nora whispered. "And he will try," Father Dominic agreed. "But even Xander isn't invincible. 3 nights ago, Victor's men tried to ambush him outside a restaurant in Capitol Hill. Xander got away, but 2 bystanders were shot in the crossfire. This war is escalating, and innocent people are getting caught in it. You need to ask yourself, is whatever you're getting from this arrangement worth the cost?" Before Nora could answer, the front door opened, and Xander's voice echoed through the house. "Nora, whose car is in the driveway?" Father Dominic stood, squeezing Nora's shoulder gently. "Think about what I said," he murmured, then moved to the hallway. "Hello, Xander. I was just leaving." Xander appeared in the doorway, his expression darkening when he saw the priest. "What are you doing here, Dominic?" "Checking on your wife," Father Dominic said mildly. "Making sure she understands what she's gotten herself into. You should do the same." He left without another word, and Xander turned to Nora, his eyes searching her face. "What did he say to you?" "The truth," Nora said quietly. "That this is dangerous, that people are getting hurt, that I should leave before it's too late." Xander's jaw tightened, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides, gripping her shoulders. "Do you want to leave?" he asked, his voice rough. "Because I'll let you go, Nora. I'll give you the money, set you up somewhere safe, and you'll never have to see me again. Is that what you want?" Nora looked up at him, at the man who'd become so much more than a stranger in a cafe. She saw the fear in his eyes, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide, and she realized that Father Dominic had been right about one thing. This had stopped being an arrangement somewhere along the way. It had become something real, something that terrified her precisely because it mattered. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I don't want to leave." Something broke in Xander's expression, and he pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her with a desperation that stole her breath. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry I dragged you into this, but I don't know how to let you go." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the fading afternoon light, the rain drumming against the windows. And Nora realized that she didn't know how to let go either. That night, everything changed. Xander received a call at midnight, Marcus's voice urgent and panicked on the other end. Nora heard only Xander's side of the conversation, clipped, controlled, deadly calm, but it was enough to know something terrible had happened. "Victor has Elena," Xander said after he hung up, his face pale. "He took her from her apartment 2 hours ago. He's demanding a meeting, me, alone, at the old canary on Harbor Island. If I don't show up by dawn, he'll kill her." "It's a trap," Nora said immediately. "You can't go." "I don't have a choice," Xander replied, already moving toward his study. "Elena is one of mine. I don't abandon my people." Nora followed him, watching as he opened a safe hidden behind a painting and began pulling out weapons. Guns, knives, ammunition. "Then take Marcus. Take your men. Don't go alone. If I bring backup, he'll know. And Elena dies," Xander said, checking the magazine of a handgun with practiced efficiency. "This is how it has to be." "Then I'm coming with you," Nora said, the words leaving her mouth before she could think them through. Xander froze, turning to stare at her. "Absolutely not. You said Victor wants you alone," Nora argued, her mind racing. "But what if you're not alone? What if your wife insists on coming because she's worried about you? It changes the dynamic, makes you seem less threatening. And if things go wrong, I can call for help, create a distraction, something." "If things go wrong, you'll die," Xander said flatly. "I won't risk that. You don't get to decide," Nora shot back, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I'm not some helpless damsel you need to protect. I chose to be here, chose to be part of this. Let me help." They stared at each other, the air between them crackling with tension. Finally, Xander exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "If you come, you do exactly what I say, when I say it. No arguments, no hesitation. Understood?" "Understood," Nora said. The drive to Harbor Island was silent and tense. The old cannery loomed against the night sky, a skeletal structure of rusted metal and broken windows. Xander parked 100 yards away, killing the engine and turning to Nora. "Stay in the car," he said. "If shooting starts, you drive away. Don't look back. Don't try to help. Just go." Xander, he silenced her with a kiss, sudden and fierce and desperate. It was the first time their lips had met, and it tasted like goodbye. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion. "In case I don't get another chance," he said quietly. "You should know that this, us, it stopped being fake for me weeks ago." Before Nora could respond, he was out of the car and walking toward the cannery, his silhouette swallowed by shadows. She watched him go, her heart pounding, her lips still tingling from his kiss. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she wasn't going to stay in the car. The cannery smelled of rust and salt water, decades of decay saturating the air. Nora crept through the darkness, staying low behind abandoned machinery, her phone clutched in one hand with 911 already dialed, her finger hovering over the call button. She could hear voices ahead, Xander's steady and controlled, another man's heavily accented and mocking. "You came alone," Viktor Kozlov said, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. How touching and foolish. Nora peered around a rusted conveyor belt and saw them. Xander standing in the center of the cannery floor, hands visible and empty. Viktor faced him, flanked by 4 armed men, and tied to a chair between them was Elena, her face bruised and bloodied, but her eyes blazing with defiant fury. "Let her go," Xander said calmly. "Your fight is with me, not her." Viktor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. He was shorter than Xander, stocky and balding, with cold blue eyes and a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. "My fight is with your entire operation," he said. "You've controlled this city for too long, Xander. It's time for new management." "So this is a takeover," Xander said. "Then make your offer. What do you want?" "Everything," Viktor replied. "Your territory, your operations, your connections. Walk away, disappear, and I'll let you and your people live. Refuse, and I'll dismantle your empire piece by piece, starting with everyone you care about." Xander's expression didn't change, but Nora saw his hands flex at his sides, a subtle tell of the rage he was controlling. "And if I agree, you'll let Elena go?" "Of course," Viktor said, his smile predatory. "I'm a man of my word." It was a lie. Nora could see it in the way Viktor's men shifted, their hands moving toward their weapons. They had no intention of letting anyone leave this cannery alive. She had to do something, had to warn Xander, but moving would give away her position. Then Xander's eyes flicked toward her hiding spot, so quick she almost missed it. He knew she was there, and in that brief glance, she saw a message. "Trust me." "All right," Xander said, raising his hands in surrender. "You win, Viktor. I'll walk away. Just let her go first." Viktor's smile widened. "I don't think so," he said, pulling a gun from his jacket. "You see, I lied. I'm not a man of my word at all." Everything happened at once. Viktor raised his gun toward Xander. Elena threw herself sideways, chair and all, crashing into one of Viktor's men. Xander dove behind a metal pillar as gunfire erupted, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. And Nora, acting on pure instinct, hit the call button on her phone and screamed, "Officer down at the Harbor Island Cannery! Multiple shooters! Send everyone!" It was a gamble. The police might arrest them all, but it was the only card she had to play, and it worked. Viktor's men hesitated, their attention splitting between Xander and the potential arrival of law enforcement. In that moment of distraction, Xander moved. He was faster than Nora would have thought possible, pulling a gun from an ankle holster and firing twice. 2 of Viktor's men went down. Marcus Chen burst through a side door. He'd been there all along, Nora realized, backup despite Xander's claim of coming alone, and took out a third. Elena, still tied to the chair, kicked out viciously, catching the 4th man in the knee and sending him sprawling. But Viktor had his gun trained on Xander, and his finger was tightening on the trigger. Nora didn't think. She grabbed a piece of rusted pipe from the ground and hurled it with all her strength. It struck Viktor's arm just as he fired, and the bullet went wide, sparking off metal instead of finding flesh. Viktor spun toward her, his face contorted with rage, and Nora realized she'd made a terrible mistake. She was exposed, unarmed, and he was raising his gun toward her. Time seemed to slow. She saw the barrel of the gun, the cold calculation in Viktor's eyes, the certainty of her own death. Then Xander was there, throwing himself between them. The gunshot was impossibly loud. Xander staggered, his hand going to his shoulder, blood blooming through his white shirt, but he didn't fall. Instead, he raised his own gun and fired once, the shot precise and final. Viktor crumpled to the ground, his weapon clattering across the concrete. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Marcus was freeing Elena, and she was on her feet despite her injuries, already barking orders into her phone. Xander turned to Nora, his face pale but his eyes fierce. "I told you to stay in the car," he said, his voice rough with pain, and something that might have been relief. "You're welcome," Nora replied, her hands shaking as the adrenaline drained away. Xander's lips curved into a smile, and then he was pulling her against him with his good arm, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You magnificent, terrifying woman," he murmured. "What am I going to do with you?" "Keep me," Nora said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "If you want to." Xander pulled back just enough to look at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "I want to," he said quietly. "God help me." I want to. The police arrived moments later, flooding the cannery with light and noise. Marcus had already crafted a story, a business dispute gone wrong, self-defense, Victor's known criminal connections. Xander's lawyers appeared as if by magic, smooth and efficient, turning a crime scene into a justifiable response to an attack. Elena vouched for everything, her injuries lending credibility to their version of events. And through it all, Xander kept Nora close, his hand never leaving hers, even as paramedics tried to treat his shoulder. "She's my wife," he told them, the words no longer a lie but a declaration. "She stays with me." By dawn, they were back at the house in Queen Anne, the city waking up around them as if nothing had happened. Xander's shoulder was bandaged, his arm in a sling, but he'd refused hospitalization. "I've had worse," he'd told the paramedics, and the casual way he said it broke Nora's heart a little. They sat on the balcony, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The rain had finally stopped, and the air smelled clean, washed free of the night's violence. "Victor's organization will crumble without him," Xander said quietly. "His lieutenants will fight among themselves, and my people will fill the vacuum. It's over." "Is it?" Nora asked, thinking of Father Dominic's warnings, of the cycle of violence that seemed endless. "For now," Xander amended. He turned to her, his expression serious. "Our month is almost up. You've fulfilled your end of the bargain, and then some. I'll transfer the money today, and I'll make sure you're set up somewhere safe, somewhere far from all of this. You can start over, be whoever you want to be." Nora looked at the diamond ring on her finger, at the man beside her who'd become so much more than a stranger in a cafe. "And if I don't want to start over?" she asked. "If I want to stay?" Xander's breath caught. "Nora, you don't know what you're saying. This life, it's dangerous, it's dark, it's yours," Nora interrupted. "And somehow in the past month, it's become mine too. I'm not naive, Xander. I know what you are, what you do, but I also know what I feel. And I know that when you kissed me last night, it wasn't part of the act, was it?" "No," Xander admitted, his voice rough. "It wasn't." "Then stop trying to send me away," Nora said, taking his hand. "Stop trying to protect me from yourself. Let me choose. And I choose this. I choose you." Xander stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to keep her versus the fear of what it might cost. Finally, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above the diamond ring. "Then stay," he whispered. "Stay, and let's see if we can make something real out of this beautiful lie." 6 months later, Nora stood in the community center in Belltown, surrounded by a dozen kids with paint-splattered hands and bright, eager faces. The walls were covered with their artwork, watercolors of the Seattle skyline, portraits of family members, abstract explosions of color that captured emotions too big for words. This was real now. Not just a cover story, but something she'd built with her own hands, something that mattered. "Miss Nora, look!" A little girl named Sophia called out, holding up a painting of a garden in full bloom. "I made it for you." Nora crouched down, examining the painting with genuine admiration. "It's beautiful, Sophia. I love how you used yellow for the sunlight. It makes everything feel warm and happy." Father Dominic watched from the doorway, a smile playing at his lips. After the night at the cannery, he'd stopped questioning Nora's place in Xander's life. Perhaps he'd seen something in the way they looked at each other, or perhaps he'd simply accepted that some things were beyond his understanding. Either way, he'd become an ally, helping Nora establish the art program, and never once asking questions about the generous donations that kept the center running. "You're good with them," he said as the kids cleaned up their supplies. "Natural. They're good kids," Nora replied, watching Sophia carefully wash her brushes. "They just need someone to believe in them, like someone once believed in Xander," Father Dominic said quietly, "and like Xander now believes in you." Nora smiled, thinking of the man who'd become her husband in truth as well as pretense. They'd made it official 3 months ago, a quiet ceremony in the San Juan Islands with Marcus, Elena, and Father Dominic as witnesses. The rings were still his grandmother's, but now they meant something different. Not a prop, but a promise. Life with Xander was complicated, no question. There were still dangers, still enemies who tested the boundaries of his territory. But Victor's death had sent a message, and the city had settled into an uneasy peace. Xander was working with Marcus to transition more of their operations into legitimate businesses, slowly building an empire that didn't rely on violence. It would take years, maybe decades, but it was a start. And through it all, they'd built something together. Not the performance they'd started with, but something real and messy and beautiful. Mornings on the balcony with coffee and comfortable silence. Evenings in the study, where Nora painted while Xander worked, their separate activities somehow bringing them closer. Nights when the nightmares came and she'd hold him, her presence a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. Her phone buzzed with a text from Xander. "Dinner at home tonight? I'm cooking." Nora smiled, typing back. "You mean you're ordering from that Italian place and pretending you cooked? You know me too well, wife. That's the idea, husband." She finished up at the center and drove home through the Seattle streets, the city that had once felt so foreign, now familiar and welcoming. The house in Queen Anne was truly home now, filled with evidence of their shared life, her paintings on the walls, his books scattered across surfaces, photographs from their wedding day on the mantel. Xander met her at the door, pulling her into a kiss that still made her heart race. His shoulder had healed, leaving only a faint scar that she sometimes traced with her fingers in the quiet moments before sleep. "How were the kids?" he asked, taking her coat. "Wonderful," Nora said, following him to the kitchen where takeout containers were indeed laid out on the counter. "Sophia made me a painting. I think we might have a real artist on our hands." "Like her teacher," Xander said, pouring wine into 2 glasses. "Father Dominic called. He wants to expand the program, add music classes. I told him we'd fund it." "We?" Nora asked, raising an eyebrow. "We," Xander confirmed, handing her a glass. "You're not just my wife, Nora. You're my partner. In everything." They ate dinner on the balcony, watching the sun set over Puget Sound, painting the water in shades of orange and pink. The rain had held off for once, and the air was warm with the promise of summer. "Do you ever regret it?" Xander asked suddenly. "That day in the cafe? Saying yes?" Nora thought about it, about the scared, lonely woman she'd been 6 months ago, about the risks she'd taken, the dangers she'd faced, the life she'd stepped into without fully understanding the cost. "No," she said finally. "Do you? Regret sitting down at my table?" Xander reached across and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring, the same gesture he'd used that first day, but now filled with genuine affection instead of desperate pretense. "It was the best decision I ever made," he said quietly. "You saved my life that day, Nora. Not just from Victor's men, but from myself. You reminded me that there's more to life than survival, more than power and territory. You gave me something to fight for besides fear." "You gave me something too," Nora said, squeezing his hand. "Purpose, belonging, a reason to be brave." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, the city lights beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in Belltown, kids were going home with paint under their fingernails and art in their hearts. Somewhere in the port of Seattle, Marcus was overseeing a legitimate shipping operation that would never make headlines. Somewhere in Pioneer Square, Elena was closing a deal on a property that would house affordable apartments instead of serving as a front for money laundering. And here, on a balcony in Queen Anne, 2 people who'd started as strangers bound by desperation had become something more: partners, lovers, friends, a mafia boss, and the woman who'd pretended to be his wife until the pretense became truth. "I love you," Xander said, the words still new enough to carry weight, still precious enough to matter. "In case I don't say it enough." "You say it plenty," Nora replied, leaning against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "But I never get tired of hearing it. I love you too." The rain began to fall again, soft and gentle, washing the city clean. But this time, they didn't go inside. They stayed on the balcony, wrapped in each other's arms, letting the rain fall around them like a blessing. Because they'd learned, in the months since that fateful afternoon in a cafe, that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes salvation arrives in the form of a stranger with desperate eyes and a dangerous proposition. Sometimes love grows in the space between truth and lies, between fear and courage, between who you were and who you choose to become. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the person you pretend to love becomes the person you can't imagine living without. The diamond ring on Nora's finger caught the light from the house, throwing rainbows across the rain-slicked balcony. It was the same ring Xander had given her that first night, but it meant something different now. Not a prop, not a symbol of a temporary arrangement, but a promise that had been tested by fire and violence and fear. and had emerged stronger for it. Inside the house, their life waited. Complicated, imperfect, but undeniably theirs. And as they finally moved inside, shaking rain from their hair and laughing at their own foolishness for staying out in the weather, Nora realized that this was what happiness looked like. Not perfect, not safe, but real. Achingly, beautifully real. Xander pulled her close in the warmth of the house, his lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted of rain and wine and promises kept. "Thank you," he whispered against her mouth, "for saying yes, for staying, for choosing this life, even when it scared you." "Thank you for sitting down at my table," Nora replied, her fingers threading through his hair, "for giving me a reason to be brave, for showing me that sometimes the scariest choices lead to the most beautiful destinations." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the quiet house, the rain drumming a gentle rhythm against the windows. And in that moment, Nora understood that the story that had begun with a desperate gamble in a Seattle cafe had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. A love story written in the margins of danger, a partnership forged in fire, a home built on the foundation of two broken people, choosing to be whole together. The future was uncertain. It always would be in Xander's world. But they would face it together, this mafia boss, and the woman who'd pretended to be his wife until pretense became the truest thing in both their lives. And that, Nora thought as Xander led her upstairs, his hand warm in hers, was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What was your favorite moment? What surprised you most about Nora and Xander's journey? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for listening. And until next time, remember that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest question: will you pretend